I knew something was wrong the moment the gate lights snapped on and a blinding white beam carved across my windshield like a warning slash, freezing me in place as if the farm I grew up visiting had suddenly transformed into enemy territory instead of quiet refuge my father always described. Because nothing about this place felt familiar anymore. Not the towering metal fence that hadn't existed 3 months ago, not the freshly paved road leading up to the entrance, not the 2 armed HOA. Security guards standing rigidly beside a new steel checkpoint booth, and especially not the hostility in their eyes when one of them stepped forward with a tablet in hand and barked, "Vehicle, halt. Identify yourself," in a tone that suggested I had already done something wrong simply by arriving. I told him my name, expecting recognition or at least basic courtesy since my father owned this land, but instead his expression hardened as he typed on his screen, jaw unlocking slowly, face twisting into that cold, professional detachment security people use when they're about to escalate something, and then the words came, sharp, rehearsed, and impossible to process. "You're not allowed on this property. You've been flagged. Turn around immediately." For a second, I genuinely thought he was joking or mistaking me for someone else, because why would I, his daughter, be banned from land my father had farmed for 27 years? But his eyes didn't waver, and the second guard's hand subtly drifted toward the holster at his hip, as if bracing for trouble, which only made my pulse spike harder, my throat tightening as cold dread seeped in, because this was no misunderstanding. Something had happened here, something big, something no one had told me about. My first instinct was to call my dad, to demand answers, to laugh and say, "Your HOA people are acting crazy." But when I tapped his contact, the call didn't ring. It went straight to voicemail, which never happened, because even when my dad was elbows deep in equipment or knee deep in soil, he always answered my calls, always without fail. But now it was just silence, heavy and unfamiliar, like the land itself was holding its breath. I tried again, straight to voicemail. Tried a third time. Nothing. The first guard rapped on my window, harder this time, leaning in with a sternness that didn't match the situation. "Ma'am, this is a restricted area. You need to leave." Restricted? Since when? This was a farm, not a military base. The absurdity of it twisted my confusion into irritation. Restricted how? I asked through the window, forcing my voice not to shake. "This land belongs to my father. Why would I be restricted?" He exhaled, annoyed, like I was inconveniently dragging out a script he had delivered many times before, and muttered something into his shoulder radio, his voice low, words indistinguishable, but his eyes flicked past me toward the fields, and for the briefest moment, I saw something flicker across his face, something like hesitation or fear, before he snapped back into rigid authority. "We have standing orders. You're on the list. Please cooperate." That phrase, "on the list," hit me like a stone, because lists meant bureaucracy, decisions, documentation, and someone had intentionally put my name there, someone with power over my father's property, someone who didn't want me here. My chest tightened as I pressed my palms to the steering wheel, trying to steady myself, trying to make sense of anything, when something caught my eye, movement beyond the fence near the barn, a dark silhouette darting between shadows with a speed too deliberate to be an animal. The figure paused, watching me, its outline rigid and human, and even from a distance I felt the weight of its stare, the chilling certainty that it wasn't just watching, it was waiting. The guard noticed my gaze shift and immediately stiffened, stepping slightly to block my view as he repeated, "Turn around." But now there was urgency in his voice, like the longer I stayed, the more dangerous things became. That's when I realized this wasn't just about HOA rules or property access or some paperwork mistake. The guards weren't preventing me from entering. They were trying to keep me from seeing something. My heart hammered as questions spiraled. Where was my dad? Why wasn't he answering? Who was that shadow near the barn? And how had an HOA, a homeowners association of all things, gained enough authority to ban me from my father's land? I cracked open a window to speak again, but before I could say a word, the second guard stepped closer, lowering his voice. "Ma'am, please, you don't want to be here right now." His tone was different, not hostile this time, but warning, almost pleading, and that unsettled me more than anything else because people only speak that way when danger is real. "Where's my father?" I asked, every syllable trembling. The guard's jaw tightened. He didn't answer. Instead, he pressed something on his radio, murmured, "Visitor refusing departure." And the moment he said it, the mechanical whir of the metal gate shifting began behind him. Not opening, closing, locking, sealing, trapping me outside, cutting me off. And with every inch the gate slid shut, my panic swelled deeper because it felt symbolic, like a deliberate severing of connection between me and the place my father had built with his bare hands, the place that once felt like safety but now pulsed with secrets and threats. I gripped the steering wheel, frozen, torn between leaving and fighting, but then I saw it again, this time closer, the silhouette moving with quiet, predatory certainty between the barn and the tractor shed, paused in a halo of faint yard light, just long enough for me to see the outline of a man, or at least I thought it was a man, but something about the posture, the stillness, the way he stood unnaturally stiff made my skin crawl, like he was performing the idea of a human rather than being one. The guards didn't look at him, didn't acknowledge him, didn't react at all, as if they were intentionally avoiding eye contact, as if they were trained not to see him. "Ma'am," the first guard said firmly, snapping my attention back, "I need you to reverse your vehicle immediately." His voice was harder now, less patient, and the safety of the situation felt like it was evaporating second by second. But I couldn't leave, not without seeing my father, not without understanding why this land felt like it had been swallowed by something dark and silent. I swallowed hard. "Tell me what happened here." "Ma'am, where's my father?" Silence. Heavy. Suffocating. Not refusal. Fear. The second guard subtly shook his head, not at me, but at the first guard, like he was silently begging him not to say something. And that tiny gesture, that small flicker of panic, was the moment I knew this was no ordinary HOA issue. The farm was hiding something. Something the guards were terrified to talk about. Something involving my father. Something involving me. The gate clanged into its locked position behind them. The driveway lights dimmed to an eerie, sterile glow. The silhouette near the barn disappeared again, slipping behind the tractor shed, as if melting into the darkness. My breath caught. Something deep inside me whispered that whatever was happening here, whatever the guards were covering up, whatever reason my name was placed on that list, it wasn't just about land. It was about danger, and I was already too close to it. If the HOA was really just about protecting the community, then why did one of the guards risk his job just to whisper, "You don't want to be here right now," like it was a warning at the edge of a cliff instead of simple property rule? And why did his eyes dart over my shoulder, as if he expected something or someone to appear behind me at any second? That thought wouldn't leave my head even after I finally reversed the car, tires crunching over the gravel as I pretended to obey, heart thudding heavy and uneven. Because, yes, I backed away from the gate, but there was no universe in which I was actually leaving. Not when my father's phone was dead, his land suddenly wrapped in steel and rules, and my own name was mysteriously on some restricted list that supposedly overruled blood, family, and common sense. So as soon as I reached a bend in the road where the guards couldn't see my taillights anymore, I killed the engine and let the car roll the last few feet into a pocket of shadows beside a cluster of overgrown bushes. The night swallowed me there, thick and buzzing with crickets and distant machinery, and in that tiny hidden alcove, my anger finally caught up with my fear. I sat there in the dark, phone screen light in my face as I scrolled through my messages with Dad, reading the last one he'd sent. "Come visit soon. The place is changing faster than I like." At the time, I'd assumed he meant the weather or the market or maybe the neighbors, but now those words felt heavier, like a warning I hadn't understood. I tried calling him again, voicemail. I texted him, "I'm at the gate. They won't let me in. What's going on?" Message sent, no reply. A sick, twisting frustration rose in my chest as I stared at the tiny delivered check mark, willing it to turn into something more, a typing bubble, anything, but nothing happened. Fine. If my father couldn't come to me, I'd go to him. I turned off my headlights, pocketed my phone, and stepped out into the cool night air, the smell of damp earth and distant hay instantly pulling at old memories. Running between rows of crops as a kid, helping him feed the chickens at sunrise, drinking coffee on the porch while mist clung to the ground. But the nostalgia was tainted now, overlaid with the cold metallic glint of the high fence and the low hum of security cameras rotating on their mounts. From this angle, A little ways down the road, I could see the perimeter fence running along the property, tall and severe, with vertical metal bars and occasional concrete posts. A few years ago, there had just been a sagging wire fence and a wooden gate that always creaked when you opened it. I swallowed, squinting into the distance, mapping the old layout in my head. If I remember correctly, there was a shallow ditch behind the tree line parallel to the north fence, and beyond that, a slope down to the irrigation canal. When I was younger, Dad used to joke that if I ever snuck out to visit at night, that was a route I'd have to take. At the time, I'd laughed. Now it felt like instructions from the past. I stayed low, crouching close to the bushes as I made my way along the side of the road, boots whispering over gravel, every crunch impossibly loud in my ears. Further up ahead, the glow from the gate faded behind a gentle curve in the fence, and I was swallowed deeper into shadow, with only the distant buzz of the floodlights and the faint chirping of insects keeping me company. My mind replayed what I'd seen by the barn, the stiff silhouette that the guard pretended not to see, and a chill snaked down my spine, because that kind of choreographed blindness meant one thing. The threat wasn't outside the property. It was inside, and the guards were there to keep people out long enough for whatever was happening to stay hidden. I reached the line of trees and ducked between them, branches scraping my shoulders, the ground becoming softer, uneven. Somewhat to my right, I heard water running. A slow trickle, likely the canal or a drainage stream. I moved by memory, not sight, fingers grazing rough bark as I navigate around tree trunks and roots. Finally, I spotted it. The back stretch of the fence, less guarded, no cameras immediately visible. Either they hadn't finished installing them, or the HOA had been confident no one would be stupid enough to sneak in through this side. Joke's on them, I thought, even though my heart was beating so hard it felt like it might bruise my ribs from the inside. The fence loomed closer, and that's when I saw it. A gap, not big, not obvious, but there, a section where the bottom of the fence didn't quite meet the ground due to an uneven patch of earth. The space was only a few inches high, but the dirt beneath it was recently disturbed, the grass flattened as though someone had already tested it, maybe more than once. I knelt, running my fingers over the soil. Fresh tracks, boots maybe more than one set. My skin prickled. Someone else had come in this way, or gone out. For a moment I hesitated, the reality of what I was about to do crashing over me, trespassing on my own father's land. That's what this HOA setup had done. Turned me into an intruder, anger sharpened my resolve. I lay flat, inhaled, and began wriggling under the fence, shoulders scraping, jacket catching against cold metal. The faint sound of water and wind blended with the louder roar of my pulse. For a terrifying second, I got stuck halfway, the bars pressing down on my back, the smell of iron and dirt filling my nose, and I imagined a guard's flashlight suddenly slicing to the darkness, a voice shouting, hands grabbing my ankles, but no one came. I exhaled, twisted, and shoved off the ground, dragging myself the last few inches until I finally rolled onto the other side, breathless, clothes dusty, heart racing but weirdly triumphant. I was inside. The first thing I noticed was how different the farm felt up close. From the road, it had just looked like darker land behind a fence, but within the property line, everything was sharper, more controlled, more wrong. The fields that used to be wild and organic, with uneven rows and patches of wildflowers, were now perfectly regimented lines of crops, each row identical, almost too neat, as if planted by machines that didn't understand chaos or character. Large industrial lights on poles stood at intervals, leaving islands of harsh white brightness, surrounded by seas of pitch-black shadow. The old wooden barn had been reinforced with metal panels, its doors upgraded with electronic locks that glowed faintly red. And near the farmhouse, farther up the hill, I could just make out rectangular shapes, new structures that hadn't been there before. Storage units? Offices? Or something else entirely? I kept low, moving along the edge of the field where the crops met the tree line. The farmhouse windows were dark. No light, no TV flicker, no familiar glow from the kitchen, where Dad always left one small lamp on, just in case he woke up in the middle of the night and wanted tea. The absence of that tiny light hurt more than the fence, more than the guns, more than the guard's cold dismissal. Something had stolen my father's habits from this land. I ducked behind a large metal irrigation unit and pulled out my phone, hoping maybe, now that I was closer, I'd catch a stray Wi-Fi signal or some local network my dad might have set up, but there was nothing, no bars, no Wi-Fi, just a small mocking SOS only in the corner. Whatever the HOA had done here, they'd turned the farm into a dead zone, a control bubble, a place meant to keep signals from escaping. As I slipped the phone back into my pocket, a soft crunch behind me made my blood run cold. I froze, every muscle locked, listening. Another crunch. Closer. Not an animal. Too heavy. Human footsteps on dry grass. Slowly, I turned my head. A flashlight beam cut through the darkness not 10 feet away, sweeping low to ground as someone approached from the direction of the barn. Instinctively, I sank to my knees and rolled behind the irrigation machinery, pressing myself against the cold metal, barely daring to breathe. The beam moved rhythmically, scanning, measured, like whoever held it was used to searching this exact path. I heard a man humming under his breath, a tuneless, flat sound that made the hair on my arm stand up purely because of how casual it was. Whoever he was comfortable here. This was his territory now. The light crept closer, halo widening, until it grazed the edge of the machinery I hid behind. My heart slammed so loudly in my ears I was convinced he'd hear it. "Fence breach again," the man muttered, voice low and annoyed, like he was talking to himself. My stomach dropped. He must have seen the disturbed dirt under the fence, too. Of course he had. My only hope was that he assumed it was done earlier by someone else. But I didn't dare move, didn't dare shift even an inch. The beam slid over the ground, paused, then shifted away. Footsteps continued past me, moving toward the back corner of the property, where the fence met the canal. I waited. 5 seconds. 10. 20. The flashlight glow shrank, then disappeared behind a rise in the land, leaving me alone again in the darkness. But not really alone, because the realization lingered. They were actively monitoring the perimeter, and if they were checking for breaches, it meant someone had been trying to get in or out, often enough to make them paranoid. Maybe my father, maybe someone else. I exhaled shakily and peered around the edge of the machinery. The way to the farmhouse looked clear. The barn, though, that haunted my peripheral vision, looming like a witness. That was where I'd seen the stiff silhouette earlier. That was where the man with the flashlight had come from. And between those two places, something was happening that the HOA didn't want anyone to see. I debated, house or barn first. Common sense screamed house, but instinct tugged me toward the barn. Dad wouldn't be sitting calmly in his living room with all this going on. If he was here at all, he'd be out there in the thick of it, or he'd be the reason for it. I swallowed, forcing my legs to move as I crept along the darker patches of the field, weaving between equipment and shadows, inching closer to the barn. The smell grew stronger as I approached. Not just hay and soil, but chemicals sharp and sterile, like disinfectant or fertilizer, or something lab-grade. A low electrical hum thrummed from its walls. They'd rewired it. Up close, I could see new ventilation units installed near the roof. Faint mist drifting from one of the side vents, evaporating into the night. A keypad glowed beside the main door, red numbers bright against the dark wood. I pressed myself against the wall, fingers grazing the keypad absent-mindedly, my mind racing through possibilities. Laboratory. Storage for something illegal. A quarantine zone. My head spun with too many scenarios and not enough facts. Then, from inside, I heard it, a muffled voice. Low. Pained. My heart lurched. It was impossible to make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable. Someone was arguing. No, not quite. Pleading. The sound sliced through me like a blade because of the rhythm of it, the cadence beneath the roughness. It sounded like my father. I pressed my ear to the wooden panel beside the metal reinforcement, ignoring the cold creeping into my skin. Told you, this is what I agreed to. The voice cut in and out, broken by the humming machinery and the buzz of electrical lines, but I caught enough. That was my dad's tone when he was angry, but trying to stay polite. Another voice answered, smoother, colder, threaded with authority. You signed. The association has full operational discretion. You don't make the rules here anymore, Mr. Harlow. My father tried again, louder this time, his anger bleeding through. My land, my daughter, you have no right. The rest blurred. Daughter. The word rang in my head like a bell. They were talking about me. I wasn't just on some random list. I was a problem they had discussed officially, inside that barn, like I was a threat to whatever their Operation Discretion was hiding. Blood pounded in my ears as I pressed even harder against the wall, desperate to catch more. The second voice dropped lower, its smugness replaced by something more clinical. You know the conditions. No outside visitors. No unapproved contact. The board was very clear after the last incident. My stomach twisted. Last incident? What incident? My father's voice snapped, sharper now, raw with something that sounded dangerously close to despair. She has a right to know what you're doing on her family's land. There was a pause, heavy and chilling. Then the other man chuckled softly, a sound so devoid of warmth it made my skin crawl. She had a right, Mr. Harlow. Past tense. As of yesterday's vote, she is legally recognized as a disruptive entity on this property. She won't be coming here again. I stumbled back a fraction, breath catching, understanding slamming into me like a truck. Yesterday had been the day I'd sent Dad a casual message saying I planned to drive out this week. They must have seen it. Maybe he'd mentioned it. Maybe someone had tracked our communication. Either way, they had acted. They'd actually voted to define me as a disruptive entity, like I was some infestation to be kept out. My father must have reacted, because the next noise I heard was something metal crashing, followed by a strangled curse. The other man didn't sound surprised. If anything, he sounded bored. Careful now. You know the terms. Noncompliance has consequences, for you and for her. There was a click, like a switch being flipped, followed by a sound I couldn't place, a low whine that built into a higher-pitched hum, then something that might have been a door or panel sliding shut. My heart slammed against my ribs as dread coiled tighter and tighter in my chest. I couldn't stand out here listening like a ghost while my father was being pressured, or worse, inside. I had to do something. I glanced back at the keypad, mind racing. I'd watched my dad punch codes into old devices 1,000 times, garage doors, locks, equipment panels, and he tended to recycle numbers he liked, birthdays, anniversary dates, the year he bought the farm. My thumb hovered over the pad as my brain frantically cycled through combinations. His birth year, 1962. Their anniversary, 09-17. The year he bought the farm, 1998. I entered 1-9-9-8. The keypad beeped once, rejected. I tried 0-9-1-7. Another sharp beep. My palms were sweating, fingers trembling slightly. If this thing triggered an alarm after too many attempts, I'd bring the entire HOA security team down on me before I even got to the door. But I couldn't just walk away. Dad's last text floated through my mind again. The place is changing faster than I like. Change. That's what he'd written. Not they're changing it. Not, it's different. He personified the place, like the land itself was shifting under his feet. I stared at the darkness around me, the regimented rows of crops, the humming lights, the new structures. This wasn't just about an HOA enforcing petty rules. They were using his land for something that needed secrecy, something that needed test subjects or isolation or both. I took a deep breath, wiped my fingers on my jeans, and punched in another code. My birthday, 0-3-2-6. A small green light blinked once, then turned solid. The hum from the door lock changed pitch. My breath hitched as the mechanism clicked, metal latches retracting. The door unlocked. Slowly, carefully, I wrapped my hand around the handle, every nerve in my body screaming that once I crossed this threshold, I wouldn't just be trespassing on HOA control land. I'd be stepping into the heart of whatever they were willing to threaten my father over. I pulled the door open an inch, a cold rush of sterile air gusting past me carrying that same sharp chemical smell, stronger now, almost burning my nose, along with something else underneath it. Something metallic, faintly coppery, terrifyingly familiar. Blood. I swallowed hard, forcing myself not to gag as I pushed the door wider and slipped inside, letting it ease shut behind me with a soft thud that sounded far too final. cutting me off from the outside world, trapping me in the strange mechanical hum and dim fluorescent glow of the barn-turn facility. Rows of gleaming equipment lined the walls, wires snaking across the floor, monitors blinking with charts and signatures I didn't understand. And in the center of the space, under the harsh overhead light, were two figures. One, a man in a crisp gray blazer with an HOA badge clipped neatly to his lapel, his back partially turned. The other, facing him with fists clenched and eyes blazing, was my father. His gaze jerked toward the door the moment it clicked fully shut, as if he could sense me even before he saw me, his expression shifting from anger to shock to something much worse, a mix of fear and fierce protectiveness. As our eyes met, the HOA man followed his line of sight, turning slowly, his curious frown freezing into a thin, dangerous smile the second he saw me standing there, dust on my clothes, defiance in my eyes. "Well," he said calmly, like he'd just discovered an interesting lab result instead of a trespassing human being, "it appears our disruptive entity found a way in after all." My father took a step toward me, voice hoarse with urgency. "You shouldn't be here," but it was too late. The door behind me hissed as the lock re-engaged, bolts slamming into place, sealing us in, and somewhere high above, a small camera pivoted with a soft mechanical whir, focusing its unblinking glass eye directly on me. I didn't move, couldn't move, because the moment the camera above clicked into focus, my father's entire expression changed. Not just fear now, but resignation, like he knew exactly what the HOA man was about to do, and he also knew he had no power to stop it. And the man in the gray blazer, Mr. Avery, according to the tag clipped to his chest, turned fully toward me with a calmness that felt more dangerous than any raised weapon, his eyes sharp and scanning me the way a scientist looks at a specimen that wasn't meant to escape its containment box. And then he took one slow step forward, his polished shoes clicking on the concrete as he said, "You've made a serious mistake coming here," in a tone that didn't carry anger or surprise or even frustration, just certainty, absolute certainty, like my arrival was already accounted for somewhere deep in their paperwork, filed under consequences he intended to carry out. My father moved before I could answer, stepping between us, his shoulders square with the same stubborn protection he used when I was a child, and a neighbor's dog snapped at me. But this time his posture shook slightly, betraying exhaustion beneath his defiance, and he snapped, "She leaves. Right now," his voice shaking with a mix of fury and desperation, as if sheer force could undo the locked door behind me or the dozen layers of authority this HOA clearly wielded like a private government. But Avery only gave a quiet, pitying sigh, the kind adults give children who don't understand how the world works. "Mr. Harlow," he said softly, "we've discussed this. Your daughter is not permitted access due to elevated risk classification. You agreed to these terms." My father's jaw clenched so hard, I thought it might crack. "I agreed," he hissed, "because you gave me no choice. You said if I didn't sign, we'd what?" Avery interrupted, raising an eyebrow with deliberate challenge. And even though my father didn't finish the sentence, the silence that followed was thick enough to explain everything he didn't say. Threats, coercion, leverage, something powerful enough to force a proud man into compliance. I took a step forward, anger rising hotter than fear. "What risk?" I demanded, voice echoing across the metal interior. Because nothing about this made sense. Why an HOA would classify me as a threat. Why they'd lock down a farm like a research compound. Why my father looked like a man caught in a contract with the devil. Avery turned his head slightly, regarding me like a puzzle piece that had fallen into the wrong box. "You," he said calmly, "should not be here." The way he said it wasn't accusatory. It was diagnostic, like he truly believed I was in a place that violated the laws of nature. "Your presence disrupts stability. We monitor stability very carefully." My skin crawled. Stability? I opened my mouth to demand answers, but Avery continued before I could speak. "Since you're already inside," he said, clasping his hands behind his back, "you might as well understand what your father's been trying, unsuccessfully, to hide from you." My father lunged forward, grabbing Avery by the arm with a grip I'd never seen him use, raw and trembling. "Don't," he warned, voice ragged. Avery didn't flinch. He simply looked down at the hand gripping him, as if measuring whether my father would be capable of doing anything meaningful with that anger. Then he gently peeled my father's fingers away with chilling patience. "You signed the access disclosure agreement," he said quietly. "This is protocol." He turned to me. "Follow." My father stepped in front of me again, voice cracking. "She's not part of this. She is now." Avery said, his tone dropping to something colder, deeper, unblinking. "She forced entry. She triggered external surveillance. She is officially within the radius." Radius. Protocol. Risk classification. This wasn't an HOA. This was a containment facility disguised as a neighborhood association. And whatever they were containing, my father knew about it. Avery walked toward a metal door on the far side of the barn, a door I hadn't noticed before, because it blended seamlessly into the reinforced wall panels. But now that I followed his path with my eyes, I realized it wasn't a storage door. It was a security barrier. Thick, industrial, with a biometric scanner mounted beside it. Avery placed his palm on the scanner. The machine whirred, lights flickering blue, then green, and the door slid open with a hiss of pressurized air. Inside was a corridor, bright, sterile, too bright for a barn. Too sterile for farmland. I felt my father's hand grip my wrist, desperate. "Please," he whispered, "don't go with him." Avery didn't turn around, but his voice drifted out like chilled air. "She doesn't have a choice." I looked at my father, really looked, and for the first time, I noticed how much he had aged in just a few months since I'd last visited. Lines etched deeper, shoulders heavier, eyes rimmed with sleeplessness. But more than anything, I saw guilt, carved into him like a brand. Whatever was happening here, my father wasn't just a victim. He was involved, or he'd been forced to be involved. Either way, I couldn't leave without knowing. I gently pulled my wrist from his grasp and stepped toward Avery. My father's breath stuttered as if I'd stabbed him. Avery gestured for me to follow him down the corridor. "Stay close," he said without looking back. "There are areas you are not authorized to see." The irony nearly made me laugh. Not authorized, as if any of this should exist in the first place. I stepped inside. The corridor was narrow and cold, lined with metal panels. The overhead lights buzzing faintly with a white, clinical glow. It felt underground, even though logically I knew we were still at ground level. Avery walked ahead in calm, measured strides, not checking whether I or my father were following. He already knew we would, or that we had no alternative. We passed sealed doors with warning labels I didn't have time to fully read. Caution, biosecure area, restricted access level 3, authorized personnel only, but each one added another layer of dread to the knot tightening in my chest. I whispered to my father without turning my head, "What is this place?" His voice came out cracked, something I should never have agreed to. Avery stopped suddenly. We halted behind him. He pressed his hand to another scanner. This door was thicker, the edges reinforced with bolts. When it opened, a cold gust rushed past us like the breath of something buried deep. He stepped aside. "After you." I hesitated, not out of fear, but out of instinct, because stepping into that room felt like stepping across a threshold that would change everything, like crossing a point of no return. But I walked in. The room beyond was vast, far bigger than the barn should have allowed. Industrial lights hung from a ceiling so high it disappeared into shadows. The concrete floor stretched across a space filled with long glass partitions, each forming a rectangular enclosure. Some were empty, some weren't, and it took me a moment to realize that the figures inside the glass rooms weren't mannequins or shadows. They were people, or they used to be. My breath caught, horror clawing at my throat. The figures moved or tried to, in slow, unnatural motions, limbs jerking like the signals weren't reaching their joints properly, heads held at angles that no human neck should be able to maintain. Their eyes were open, but empty. Some stood, some sat, some pressed their palms to glass in repetitive motion, like they were responding to a command no one else could hear. What is this?" I whispered. Avery didn't answer at first. He simply observed me, waiting for the shock to settle into a deeper understanding. My father stepped beside me, eyes full of the same grief he'd tried to hide since I arrived. "They're residents," he whispered. My pulse stopped. "Residents." People from the community, he said, swallowing hard. People who failed protocol. Protocol. Stability. Classification. My stomach heaved. Avery finally spoke, his voice smooth and clinical. The association monitors behavioral patterns, he explained. Predictive compliance mapping. When a resident becomes a risk to themselves, to the environment, or to the continuity of our operation, they are relocated. Relocated? I echoed, but I already knew the truth. The glass rooms, the vacant eyes, the slow, broken movements. This wasn't relocation. This was containment. What did you do to them? I demanded, my voice cracking. Avery clasped his hands behind him. Correction. Correction? I repeated, voice rising with disbelief. You're experimenting on them. Avery raised a brow, almost offended. We're improving them. My father turned away, rubbing a trembling hand over his face. I didn't wait for Avery to finish whatever polished, monstrous explanation he had prepared, because the moment my father whispered, "It wasn't supposed to be like this," something inside me snapped. The fear burned off. The confusion settled into a razor-sharp line, and all that remained was a furious clarity that if I didn't end this now, neither of us would leave this facility as ourselves. So I grabbed my father's arm and hissed, "We're leaving!" But Avery only chuckled softly, shaking his head with the calm certainty of someone who believed the universe itself was on his side. And he said, "Leaving isn't an option anymore, not for either of you," while gesturing casually toward one of the glass containment units where a figure, once a person, dragged its palm down the transparent wall in slow, circular motions like a malfunctioning machine. And that image carved itself into me with such horror that survival instincts overrode fear entirely. Without warning, I spun and slammed my shoulder into Avery, knocking him off balance just long enough for my father to shove him backward into a metal panel, alarms chirping as some unauthorized contact triggered a silent fault line in their security system, and Avery's composed expression finally cracked into something furious and startled. But I didn't stop to admire it. We ran, sprinting down the sterile corridor, alarms intensifying behind us like mechanical screams, while red emergency lights bathed the walls in pulses of blood. Colored flashes. My father stumbled but kept going, breath ragged, whispering directions between gasps. "Left at the end, don't touch the yellow doors. Keep your head down." And I followed every instruction, even though I barely understood them, because I had navigated these halls under duress long enough to know the shape of danger here better than any map. But as we reached the final turn, 2 guards rounded the corner ahead, rifles raised, eyes wide with the shock of seeing unauthorized movement this deep inside their sanctum, and for a split second we froze. Me gripping my father's arm, my father gripping whatever strength he had left, but then the lights flickered with a sudden power surge, the alarms glitching in their rhythm, and the guards hesitated, momentarily thrown by the electrical chaos. So I yanked my father toward a maintenance hatch he pointed out with a desperate shake of his head, and we slipped inside just as the guards regained their footing, bullets striking. The metal door behind us with thunderous clangs that echoed to a cramped service tunnel. The tunnel was narrow, dark, and stifling, pipes hissing overhead, puddles of coolant splashing beneath our feet, and the faint vibrations of boots above us reminded me that we were only inches from being caught. But my father whispered, "Keep going. The hatch leads to the old generator room." They never removed the exit grate. And that tiny miracle of negligence became our entire hope. We crawled through the last stretch and burst into a low-ceilinged room filled with rusted machinery, the air thick with dust and oil, and in the far corner, half hidden behind an obsolete turbine, was the grate, its bolts loosened, its mesh dented, exactly as my father had left it the last time he dared attempt escape, and he whispered, "Quick!" before they reroute the alarms. But he didn't need to tell me twice. I tore the grate open with shaking hands and helped him climb out first, then followed him onto the cold night soil behind the barn, the open air hitting my face like a slap of freedom before the sound of guards shouting inside reminded us that freedom was fragile and seconds short-lived. We crouched low, moving in frantic silence toward the tree line, but as we neared the shadows, something caught my father's eye, something that made his entire body go rigid, and when I followed his gaze, my stomach plunged. Across the field, dozens of containment units were being evacuated. Through a secondary door, silhouettes with broken movements being herded toward a transport vehicle, and among them, God, I wish I hadn't seen it. Was a stiff shadow I'd seen near the bar my first night here, moving with unnatural jerks under floodlights, its empty gaze sweeping the dark horizon, and for one horrifying moment, it turned its head directly toward us, its eyes locking onto mine with chilling, unnatural stillness that made every instinct in me scream that whatever those corrected residents had become, they were no longer merely victims. They were something the HOA believed they could use. My father grabbed my hand, voice cracking into a hoarse whisper, "Don't look. Keep moving, if they sense you." But it was too late, because the creature, no, the person had turned into a creature, lifted its arm slowly, mechanically, and pointed straight at us, its finger trembling as alarms erupted again with renewed fury, this time louder, localized, targeted, because the system had detected a breach, not from my code entry, not from Avery's shove, but from one of their residents identifying an anomaly, and within seconds, guards surged out of the barn like unleashed hounds, lights cutting to the night, voices barking orders, boots pounding toward our direction. But my father dragged me into the trees, breath ragged, repeating, "Don't stop, don't stop, don't stop," like a mantra carved into desperation. And we ran, branches whipping our faces, thorns scratching our arms, adrenaline drowning everything except the need to get as far from the property as possible, the lights behind. Us growing smaller, but the shouts growing angrier, more disorganized, like the system was glitching between human commands and whatever protocols controlled the residents. Finally, when our legs nearly gave out, we reached the shallow ditch beside the north fence, the same spot I crawled under earlier, and my father collapsed beside me, eyes shining with tears of both exhaustion and devastation as he whispered, "I should have told you sooner," but there was no time for confessions because the guards had reached the barn exit and were flooding into the fields, their lights slicing the darkness in widening arcs. So I dropped to the ground and began digging out the loosened dirt beneath the fence with frantic, numb fingers, the soil cold and wet as it packed under my nails, until the gap was wide enough for him to squeeze through, barely, and he crawled under with a grunt of pain, his shirt catching on the metal, his shoulders scraping hard enough to draw blood. But he made it, and I followed, heart pounding so violently I thought it might tear apart. But just as I dragged my foot through, a beam of light sliced across the fence behind us, too close for comfort, and a guard shouted, "There, by the north ditch," which sent a jolt of pure terror ripping through me. But my father grabbed my arm and pulled me upright, and we ran again, stumbling through the trees until floodlights disappeared entirely behind the dense canopy. When we finally stopped, collapsing against the hood of my hidden car, both of us shaking so violently we could hardly speak, my father turned to me, eyes filled with the weight of everything he'd been forced to keep secret, and he whispered, "They won't stop looking." And I knew he was right, not because he was paranoid, not because he was frightened, but because in the glow of the distant property lights we could still see the silhouettes near the barn being loaded into the transport truck. And standing among them, its head tilted at an unnatural angle, its finger still faintly raised, was the same resident who had pointed us out, watching us with hollow precision, as if memorizing our escape route for later, and in that moment I understood the real horror. We escaped the facility, but the facility would not stay contained forever, and whatever they were creating inside those glass rooms had now seen us, recognized us, and the HOA, whatever it truly was, would come for us both, not because we were threats, but because now we knew what they were training their residents to become.